We always have a few problems with the electronics. Okay, here we go. All right. The seed for Riverdale was planted by Buzzy Anderson. And she asked me to do a talk on the great rivers of America, which I agreed to do. And this afternoon, there'll be some skips of things. I don't know what all's going on this afternoon, but there's more this afternoon at 2, is that correct? 2 o'clock. Okay. Rivers have had a terrible, terrible, wonderful influence on the United States. I'll give you something to work on at noon. 15 states are named for rivers. The student, get with your table mates and see if you can name them all. The first 7 are very easy. The remainder of them are a little more difficult unless you happen to live in that state. 42 states out of the lower 48 use rivers as boundaries. Some of them very extensive, like this whole southern border of Texas is the Rio Grande River. You can see from the bottom here that we don't have the bragging rights for the longest river. The Nile and the Amazon, apparently they go back and forth looking for bragging rights. Right now, the Amazon shows as the longest. They always try to find some little tributary somewhere that can add a few miles, so they've got the longest river. This is the river net in the United States. And tying into all of those rivers are tributaries, some of them rather large. And if you look, you can see the demarcation line right through here, which is the Allegheny Ridge. And everything on this side of it flows into the Atlantic. On the other side, on the western side, it flows into the Mississippi drainage basin. Same thing is true on the west. The Rocky Mountains demark this line across here, and there's only really one major river in the west, and that's the Columbia, and we'll talk about that a little later. Oh boy.
Oh boy.
Okay. Now, I said the river system in the United States is the finest in the world, and it has made this country a great country because we have used the river system extensively. The European rivers all have problems of some one nature or another. This is the Danube River. The Danube is 1,830 miles long. It starts in Germany, and it flows through or makes a border for Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria. So if any one of those places has a little political hiccup of some kind, you can see what it could do to the river traffic. And it ends up in the Black Sea, still 1,000 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a long way to use that river as a commercial river. So right now, I guess it's mostly tour boats. And you can see it is beautiful. The next river in Europe, and it's a Russian river, but this part of Russia is considered to be part of Europe, is the Volga. And it's also a very long river. In fact, it's the longest river in Europe. But it also flows into the Black Sea. So it's a long way from being able to use it as a good shipping river. All of these rivers, by the edict of the Corps of Engineers, are considered to be navigable. And you can just about double or maybe even 3 times what is shown there as to what the Corps of Engineers considers to be a navigable river. I think if you could put a canoe on it, they would like to have it. Now let's imagine that you have just sailed into the eastern United States for the very first time, and you got a choice. Are you going to try to go overland, or are you going to find a nice, smooth river? Well, they chose the rivers, and so that's the way this country was pretty much explored, was by the rivers. I'm losing all my papers here.
I got you.
Oh, that is. Oh, thank you. The biggest river in the Northeast, in the far Northeast, is the Kayla. And it's a recreational river, as in most of the rivers in the U.S. And at the end is Bath. And Bath, at one time, had 16 shipbuilding facilities. They're down to one now, the Bath Iron Works. And the Bath Iron Works turns out many, many boats for the military. During the Second World War, the Bath Iron Works was making a destroyer every 17 days, which is an incredible feat. I think the boat that is shown here is the USS New York that was made from the scrap of the World Trade Center. 72 tons of girders were melted down to make that boat. Second river coming down that's important is the Connecticut River. Two things in the Connecticut River. First of all, I want to point out, see the railroad tracks? Well, the railroads follow the rivers because railroads can only operate with about a 3% grade. So if you're going to find a level path, rivers is probably the best way to do that. So the railroads follow the rivers. There was another reason. The towns were already established along the rivers, so they connected the railroads to the towns. The second thing about the Connecticut River is that it was the upper reaches of the Connecticut along the Berkshires and the Catskills and so forth. If you remember the map where I showed you the Appalachian Mountain, the upper reaches of that come relatively close to the coast, which meant that there were nice falling streams. And it was the rivers that feed the Connecticut River that started the Industrial Revolution using water power. Now we're going to go down to New York. And this is the East River, which is not a river at all. It connects Long Island Sound with the Hudson River. So it's brackish and it's tidal. But it's a very important river because it has protected harbors, and that, of course, is very important to shipping. Notice that beautiful clipper ship there. But if you look down here, there's a steamboat, a side wheel steamboat. These things were extremely maneuverable. You could reverse one of the paddles, and so the boat was able to turn around in its own length. We'll talk a little more about river boats a little later on. But the person who invented the first steamboat was John Fish. And he did what a lot of inventors do. He tried to mimic what man does. So he had rowers that were connected to a steam engine. And it was not a particularly practical idea. He demonstrated this on the Delaware River right outside of Philadelphia. And a whole group of men came down to watch the demonstration. Among these men were George Washington and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and the whole crew. And after they got done watching the demonstration, they went back to Independence Hall and continued writing the Constitution of the United States. Fish didn't have the money or the political influence to promote his idea. So a couple of years later, in 1889, a guy named Robert Fulton built a steamboat that used paddles. And he built it over in France and put it on the Seine. And there was an American that happened to be in Paris at the time that witnessed it, and he was a politically influenced man from New York State, also a very wealthy man. And he decided to back Fulton. So Fulton perfected a steamboat that was a viable device and put it on the Hudson River and proceeded to get Fitch's monopoly on the use of steamboats on the Hudson revoked and get his put in. Robert Livingston was in Paris at the time. It's funny how these things all end up tying together. He was over there negotiating the Louisiana Purchase, which took place in 1803, 5 years later. So out of that evolved this kind of steamboat. This again is a side wheeler, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later too. The Hudson River is tidal all the way up to Albany, and so the boats always ran with the tide, and they loved to race each other, much to the delight of their passengers. I think anytime, the first guy who made something with two wheels, I'm sure the second guy wanted to race him. This is the Port of Philadelphia. This is on the Delaware River. And this is tidal also. The Delaware is a navigable river as far as Trenton, New Jersey. I'm not sure you could run a boat that far now, but it used to be. This is the west branch of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. The Susquehanna was an old river and had a very wide, the lower sections of it had a very wide valley. Consequently, it was very shallow. But the Susquehanna served a marvelous purpose. You can see how this is wooded. Millions and millions of board feet of lumber were floated down the Susquehanna into the Chesapeake Bay. They floated them down on big rafts with the logs all tied together. It was a very dangerous business. And when they got down there were sawmills. And so the forests of Pennsylvania supplied much of the lumber for the building boom that took place in the early U.S. Well, one thing I forgot to tell you about the Hudson River, when Fulton and Livingston got this monopoly to operate steamboats on the Hudson, by 1820, there were a whole bunch of operators, and they were operating under a license from Fulton. I don't know why I keep doing that. Two gentlemen decided to sue Fulton and Livingston to break the monopoly. And of course, it ended up in the Supreme Court. And the case was Ogden and Gibson versus Fulton and Livingston. And the Supreme Court decided this in 1820. And it was that court case that set the standard for the interstate commerce laws that are followed today. And I asked asked my son, who's an attorney, I said, do they still teach that? He said, oh yes, that's a very important course that's taught in law school to this day. It was done in 1820.
Who won?
Ogden and Gibson won. Now, if you happen to get north of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on the Susquehanna, you'll find a stern wheel boat, you can see it here, that is one of the cheapest tourist attractions in the whole country, probably. The river's almost a mile wide here, and you can get on that boat and go across the river for $5. If you want to come back, it's another $5. They also take cars and small trucks. And it's all run by volunteers, because this is the oldest ferry boat operating in the United States. And it's done by the volunteers or members of the Historical Society. This is where the Delaware River comes in and makes Delaware Bay. And this is where the Susquehanna River comes in, and that's the Chesapeake Bay. And that's, the Chesapeake is, of course, renowned boater's paradise. Now, this whole row of southern rivers, you can see through here, starting with the Potomac and runs down through Pimlico, the Neuse, the New River, Cape Fear, the Eddystone, and the Savannah. And the Savannah River is probably one of the most important because it had a really good harbor, and that's where millions and billions of pounds of cotton were shipped out of. And if you haven't been to Savannah, you ought to do that because it's a really neat old town. It was such a pretty town that when Sherman got there in his march through Georgia, where he was burning everything and killing the animals and everything, trying to make the Southern people quit the war, Savannah was so pretty that they didn't burn it. So it's still like it was back in the late 1600s and 1700s, and it's a beautiful town. This is Harper's Ferry. We're back to Buzzy Anderson for a minute. Those of you who went to the Civil War thing that was done by Bill Milton, Buzzy owns a rifle that was made at Harper's Ferry. And of course the history, this is where the Shenandoah and the Potomac meet. And the history of this is that that's where John Brown tried to capture the arsenal that was there to start a slave revolt. And it didn't work. The interesting part to me of that is that the guy who was sent to head up the federal troops that they took out of Washington to get Brown out of there, by the way, they hung Brown just a few months later in Charleston, was Colonel Robert E. Lee. Now, rivers normally are named for the area with the greatest flow. In other words, when a second river comes into a river, if the flow is greater from that river, then that becomes the river. In this particular case, where the Allegheny River on the left and the Monongahela on the right, you can see the flow is almost equal. So instead of continuing one of those names, they just started a new name. They call it the Ohio River. And those of you who are sports fans will recognize on the lower left there, Three Rivers Stadium and the aptly named Point Park. start of the Mississippi River. Oh, I want to show you this. You can see the boundary between Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana there. That happens to be the terminal moraine from the Wisconsin Glacier, which I'm going to do a talk on in December for the Academy. Oh boy.
You're hired.
This is the beginning of the Mississippi River. I imagine this photograph's been taken probably a million times, so as you can say, we've spanned the Mississippi River. Mississippi River starts in Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota, and the lake has three small streams that feed into it. They're all about equal volume, so they just use the lake as the headwaters rather than trying to use one of the smaller streams, which is kind of interesting because they could add a few miles to the Mississippi if they used one of those. Now, between St. Louis and Minneapolis, there are 29 locks and dams on the Mississippi. I had no idea there were that many. And that's to make it navigable all the way to Minneapolis. Now, for those of you who don't remember how a lock works, there's a dam on the upper side, which raises the water level, and you open the gate up, let that water flow in, you shut the gate, shut the valve, then open the valve downstream, the boat sinks down and goes out, and you reverse the process to go the other direction. The most interesting lock in the world, as far as I'm concerned, is the lock at Peterborough, Ontario on the Trent Severn water system. I had the great fortune to come through this lock. I had a Canadian friend with a boat. And the way this works, you can barely see it on here, but there's a big piston. So they fill the upper tank with an inch more water than what is in the lower tank. And that's enough weight when they open the valve to drive this down and raise this one up. So they just do this. When this was built in 1898, it was the largest concrete structure that had ever been built. This is a barge on the Mississippi River. These barges were packed up like that. There's 15 units in there. And there was some astounding start over again. I want to give you some statistics about barge traffic that I found fascinating. Barges are normally made up of 15 units, as you see here, and pushed by a river tugboat. One 15-unit barge is the equivalent in tons of product carried to 216 railroad cars. And it's the equivalent of 1,050 trucks. Barges in this country move 15% of all the tonnage. And unless you have either spent some time on one of the Ohio or the Mississippi River, you don't realize there are barges going up and down all the time. We used to stay at a campground in East Memphis, Arkansas. And all day and all night long, barges going by. They transport gravel and limestone and wheat, and corn, and all kinds of bulk commodities.
Bob, how do they get all those 15 boats hooked together?
They have to move them around under the various spouts that drop this stuff in. And it takes a while to load one, and it takes a while to unload them. But it is so cheap compared to any other type of transportation that it's worth the time to do that. In terms of cost per mile, the cheapest way to move bulk is with pipelines, but of course you have to have a liquid. The second is barges, third railroads, fourth trucks, and fifth airplanes. But of course it's pretty obvious that you can't put strawberries through a pipeline. So every type of transportation has its advantages and disadvantages. And this is what you normally think of when you think of a riverboat today. And that is not a boat that's going to be carrying freight. And Mike Cronin sent me a list, I don't know, several months ago of why do we call things what we call them. And there was a fascinating one in there that tied right in. The very nice rooms in these boats, the freight boats still had the guest rooms. And the really nice ones, in addition to having a name on them, would have the name of a state. So you could be in Mississippi or Alabama or Ohio. And that today is why nice rooms on boats are called staterooms. Okay. This I just wanted to show to you because it's kind of interesting. When you have a river that flows through a flat area, it tends to do what they call meandering. And these are meanders on the Missouri River. And occasionally, the water flow itself will cut through one of these. When that happens, it leaves what they call an oxbow lake. Now, on the Missouri River, there were so many of these that they finally cut through them, and they saved 200 miles on the trip to the north to do that. This is a dock scene in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis was named for the ancient capital of Egypt. And consequently, when they wanted to build a concert hall and a sports arena, they built it like a pyramid. Right, and so it was financially not doing the city any good, so they sold it. And they sold it to Bass Pro Shops. And it is now one of these shopping destinations like Mall of America. There's hotel rooms and restaurants and fishing ponds and all sorts of things inside it, because it's a huge building. Because of the big drainage basin that the Mississippi River has, is subject to flooding, because if there's a torrential rain almost anywhere in that area, it ends up in the Mississippi and floods. And so Mississippi has got a reputation for being a lot of floodplains. There's more barges, barge traffic. This is near Vicksburg. We're going to stop at Vicksburg for a minute. I'm going to tell you a story. Is there anyone in here that has never heard of the Titanic? I don't see any hands. Is there anyone in here, aside maybe from Dale Smith, that has ever heard of the Sultana? I see 2 hands. 1865, in April of 1865, the Civil War had ended with Grant's surrender, or with Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. That was on the 6th, I believe, 6th of the 9th. The Sultana was on its way north from New Orleans to St. Louis. It was a side wheeler. When the war ended, the railroads in the South, some of them were still running, and so the prisoners from a prison named Cabana near Selma, Alabama, and Andersonville, which had a terrible reputation, were brought over to Vicksburg. And when the Sultana stopped, it had a boiler problem, and it stopped there because it had a boiler problem. And the captain was approached by a Union operative. He said, "I have 1,560 men that need to be transported north." They were most of them from Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. And he offered him $2.80 a man and $8 for officers. Well, the captain couldn't very well refuse an offer like that. So instead of replacing or trying to really fix the boiler, he didn't want to miss this opportunity. So he instructed his engineer to patch the boiler up so that they could get to St. Louis. So they loaded all these guys on board. You can see them. So a boat that was designed to handle 340 some people now had 2,150 people on board. So he took off on April the 25th to go to St. Louis. He stopped at Memphis, unloaded 200 people and some freight, and took off at about 1 o'clock in the morning. The river, it was in April, and so the flood, the snowmelt from the north was coming down. So the river was flooded, one of the worst floods it ever had. The water was icy cold. And about 7 miles north of Memphis, the boiler blew. Now there were 4 boilers. And this happened to be, the one that blew happened to be between 2 others. So when it blew, it ruptured them too. So 3 boilers blew up. And the men, some 300 or 400 of them, who were sleeping in the engine room because it was a warm place, all immediately died from the explosion and the steam. It threw burning embers from the fireboxes all over the rear of the boat and set it on fire. So the men had a choice of jumping into this icy cold water or burning to death. And you got to remember, these guys had just come out of a prison camp. They were weak, they were emaciated. So a lot of them had missing limbs, and they were in terrible shape. But they jumped in the river. The lucky ones found a piece of timber or something from the ship. Most of them were not lucky. And 1,000, they don't really know how many died because there was no real manifest that went with these guys. But they estimate that there was 1,560 men who died, making it the greatest naval tragedy in the history of the United States. And yet, 2 or 3 people knew about it. Why is that? Well, just 6 days before, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. And so that was the news. And they were still hunting for John Wilkes Booth. They hadn't found him yet. Also, the public was just sick of these tremendous numbers of deaths that were happening in the Civil War. At the Battle of Gettysburg, there were over 50,000 men who were wounded, and 8,000 died on both sides. So people just were numb to that. So that's the story of the Sultana, and now you know about the worst tragedy that ever occurred in the U.S. in terms of maritime deaths. This is a view at Natchez, which is a little further south. This is pretty old because you can see that there are horse-drawn carriages, and you can see the operating, really honest to goodness steamboats. And notice the way they came up to the dock and put down these gangplanks. That was so that the stern wheel could stay out into the rivers. But they were very shallow draft, but even so, that's the way they docked them, with the front down. This is the Mississippi at Baton Rouge. I love to say that. Baton Rouge. This is the Mississippi going through New Orleans. I never realized how the Mississippi wanders around through the city of New Orleans. And if you want to know anything about New Orleans, get a hold of Sugar, because she grew up there and she can tell you all kinds of stories. To the north is Lake Pontchartrain, and you can just barely see it there, but there's the causeway that goes across Lake Pontchartrain. I think it's like 22 miles long, or something like that.
Yeah.
This is the lower section of the Mississippi, obviously during the flood period. And you can see how dirty the water is. Mississippi is a very old river, and so it has carried down tons and tons and tons of silt and mud over the years until it has built up a considerable delta. It's 100 miles from where you enter the delta until you get to New Orleans. That's how big that delta is. And I couldn't tell you which one of these is the ship channel, but the Corps of Engineers spends lots of money keeping it open all the time. This is the Arkansas River. The Arkansas River, the headwaters are in Leadville, Colorado, which at one time held the distinction of being the highest incorporated city in the country at 10,500 feet. And so the first 125 miles of the Arkansas River is a rushing mountain stream and is used extensively for kayaking and that type of entertainment. When you get a little further south on the Arkansas, it turns into a very placid, calm river. This is the Little Rock. And the next thing we're going to look at is the Missouri River. And what is shown here in the dots is the travels of Lewis and Clark. If you have not ever read any of the books or studies about the Lewis and Clark expedition, you should do so because it was really fascinating. Meriwether Lewis was Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary. They were Virginia friends. And Meriwether had started his education when he was 13 years old, and he became a very good botanist and animal lover. And that's why Jefferson sent him on this expedition, because he wanted to find out what was up in this territory, because we just bought it a year before, and he wanted to know what was there. And he also wanted to help establish the fact that the U.S. had rights to the upper West Coast. Lewis knew that he really didn't have the organizing skills to take care of this group, because he was going to be the guy that was going to write the reports and so forth. But he had been in the Virginia militia, and his commanding officer was a fellow named William Clark. And so he approached him and asked him if he would take care of the military-type duties of organizing this, which Clark agreed to. Clark was the youngest of 10 children. His older brother, the third brother, was George Rogers Clark, who had a major role in the American Revolution. So all these things end up tying together. They used keel boats to go up the river. And of course, there was no steam power or anything at that point. And so they poled these boats up, as you see here. And I can't imagine what a job that must have been to do that day after day going up the river against the current. Along the way, they picked up a French-Canadian trapper and mountain man named Carbonneau. And he had a young teenage Indian wife who had just given birth to a baby that the men all called Pompey. His name was actually Jean Bastille. And this young woman acted as Carbonneau's wife acted as an interpreter for the various Indian tribes that they encountered. They ran into over 36 Indian tribes. Some were very friendly and some not so friendly. But they managed to get all the way through. They only lost one man during the whole expedition. He died of a burst appendix. So that in itself, because there were periods when they were starving to death. They were eating their shoes and everything. This young lady, that's a depiction because there really is no picture. And that shows her as an old lady, but she was really a teenage girl. And her name was Sacagawea. Everyone says Sacagawea, but it's not. It's Sacagawea. She probably is the second best known Indian, the first being Pocahontas. And I'm not talking about the senator from Massachusetts here. She was a real addition. And William Clark adopted her son, Pompeo, and educated him. And he had an interesting story all to himself, which I won't get into. Now, something you ought to put on your bucket list if you've never done this is to go to the Balloon Festival in Albuquerque. This is along the Rio Grande River, that's south of Albuquerque. And it's a beautiful sight when they put all those balloons up, and you can walk right down into the area where they're launching the balloons and talk to them. Talk real nice, you might even be able to get a ride. The Rio Grande is not a very navigable river. It flows through a lot of sandy soil, so it takes a lot of sand down to the mouth in the Gulf of Mexico. And the Corps of Engineers used to try to keep it open, but every time they dig the sand out, it would just collapse in again. So they finally gave up on that. Next one is the Colorado River. Notice the Colorado River actually goes up through here, through the Green River, and that's where it starts. But you notice it's not named that. It's named the Colorado River that goes through here. Because in 1920, the senator from Colorado decided that it didn't do for the state of Colorado to be named after a river that didn't start in Colorado. So he convinced the Department of Interior and the Geodetic Survey people to rename the river so that the Colorado River started in Colorado. And he finally had to get Congress to enact a resolution to get him to do it, because they said that's not the way we name rivers. The big feature, of course, on the Colorado River is the Grand Canyon. And there are some people who, you'll notice, most rivers have two sides, what they call the slip-off slope on one side and the high side on the other side. You notice here there's two high sides. And some geologists theorized that there was an enormous lake north of here that was left by one of the glaciers that broke through, and that the water gushed down through here all at one time, and that's why it ended up like that as opposed to being a more conventional riverbed. Colorado River, of course, is known for whitewater rafting, and you notice the smiles on all those people's faces. And just 2 minutes later, they all drowned. I'm kidding, no. they didn't. I don't know. This is the Columbia River, which is by far the largest river that flows into the Pacific Ocean from the western United States. And it handles a lot of water. It's got a good drainage basin because there's a lot of heavy rains in on the other side of the mountains in Washington and Oregon. Lewis and Clark spent their second winter right about in here at Fort Caswell. They started out over on the north side, and for some reason they didn't like it. They took a vote, and Sacagawea and Carbonell were allowed to vote, and they decided to go across the river and spend the winter near Astoria. You notice two things. There's no major city on the end of the Colorado River, which is unusual. When you think about that, there's almost always a city at the end of a major river. The reason for that is the river, when it exits, is very swift. And the Pacific Ocean is known for having some pretty big waves in it. And when that rapidly flowing water and the waves from the Pacific meet, they cause a tremendous amount of turbulence at the end of the river. And there have been over 200 major shipwrecks that have occurred in this area. So consequently, nobody wanted to use that as a port. Also, there's a lot of hydropower generated on the Columbia River. That's why the aluminum industry is up there, because they use a lot of electricity to make aluminum. And the river I grew up on, the Wabash River in Indiana. It has a pretty interesting history too. The longest canal in North America was the Wabash and Erie Canal that started in Toledo and ran to Evansville, Indiana, so that they could get from the Great Lakes directly into the Ohio River. It turned out not to be particularly financially good idea, but it did help to settle that whole area through there. And there happened to be about a 2-mile stretch of it in my hometown of Delphi, Indiana. And a bunch of historians got together and cleaned it up, because when I was a kid, it was just a algae mosquito breeding place. And they cleaned it up, and they built a river barge boat to go up and down this 2 miles and build a museum. And it's a very attractive area now. If you ever get through Delphi, Indiana, why stop them? I'm sure they'd be happy to have you. There's an old Boy Scout phrase. It's still true to this day. If lost in the woods, go downhill until you find a stream. Follow the stream, and you'll find civilization. And that's still true to this day. Our cities, if you stop and think about it, are all built on waterways, rivers or lakes. That's the Golden Gate Bridge, and that's the end.